How strange are the standards of do-gooders? Suppose you don't aspire to be a do-gooder. How much can morality demand of you? Is your life your own, to spend as you like? Or do you owe some of it to other people? And if you do owe something, then how much? The moral question here is less one of quality, what should I do, than of quantity, when can I stop? Some do-gooders say they're only doing their duty. They're only doing what everyone ought to. And if most people think their sense of duty is bizarre and unreasonable, then most people are wrong. They reject the idea that what they do is saintly or heroic, because to them, that's another way of saying that most people needn't even try to do such things. Praise is a disguised excuse. But of course it could be those do-gooders who are wrong. Nearly everyone believes that some acts go beyond the call of duty. Nearly every religion believes that there are some superior creatures, such as saints, who are capable of more than the rest of us. The philosopher J.O. Urmson has argued that it's a fundamental part of human morality to call some deeds saintly or heroic, meaning that they're very good to do, but can't possibly be demanded of anyone because the sacrifice or courage they require is too great. To reject the idea of saintliness and heroism, to say that there is no such thing as beyond the call of duty, is to say that everyone must be a saint or a hero, in the same way that everyone must pay his debts and avoid stealing. And that would be ridiculous, a morality for angels, not human beings. Here's one way of thinking about this. It's not the only way, by any means, but right now, it's one of the best known arguments for the extreme morality of do-gooders. In 1971, there was a genocide in East Pakistan, following closely upon a terrible cyclone, all in a place that was very poor to begin with. It seemed to some that if only enough money could be raised to pay for aid, then dreadful suffering could be avoided. People in rich countries heard about East Pakistan's troubles in the news, and some were sufficiently distressed that they donated money to aid organizations, whereas others were not so strongly affected. Either reaction was acceptable, since to donate money for the relief of foreigners was to go beyond what most people considered a duty. Some money was raised, but not enough. And partly, though by no means exclusively because of that, many thousands starved to death. In response to this situation, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer wrote a now famous essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, in which he argued that spending money on the trappings of middle-class life, rather than on famine relief or some other form of charitable aid, was not merely stingy, but depraved. His argument went like this. If you walk past a shallow pond and see a child drowning, ought you to save the child, even if it would mean muddying your clothes? Most people would say that of course you should. Muddy clothes are nothing compared with a dead child. Well, he argued, children are dying all the time. So if we can save them without sacrificing anything of equal importance, particularly something as unimportant as extra clothes, we ought to do it. Most of these children are nowhere near us. But what moral difference does it make if the child is in front of us or far away? If we spend $200 on clothes that could have bought life-saving food or medicine, we're still responsible for a death. And by extension, if we don't give much of what we own and earn for the relief of suffering, then we're responsible for many deaths. This article had a profound effect on many people, particularly those who, like Aaron Pitkin, had been searching for a moral direction, prompted by an uncomfortable sense that the suffering of the world demanded of them a personal and painful response. The shallow pond argument resolved this moral queasiness into sharp focus. It seemed, to Aaron at least, irrefutable. This experience was frightening. Aaron realized that he had been living even more immorally than he had imagined, and that he was going to have to change a great deal about his life. But it was also bracing. For a dyed-in-the-wool do-gooder like him, a convincing moral argument, one that dictated a clear path forward, was ultimately a comfort, even if that path involved a greater degree of asceticism than he had bargained for. To him, moral uncertainty and the feeling of indeterminate guilt and taint that came with it were more dreadful than any sacrifice. For this reason, he accepted the argument without worrying too much about the many complexities it left out, such as political questions about people in the first world presuming it to be their business to rescue impoverished foreigners, and practical questions about the limited ability of charities to solve problems, particularly in places where governments were incompetent or corrupt. But the shallow pond argument affected not only people like Aaron, who were primed to accept it. Even many of those who felt instinctively and strongly that it must be wrong were hard-pressed to say exactly how. Surely, buying a pair of shoes could not be as bad as letting a child drown in front of you, such a person might think. Surely, a person who declined to reduce himself and his family to penury could not be as bad as a serial murderer. If either of these things were true, then our moral intuitions must be so badly flawed that we should shut our ears to them altogether. And if our intuitions were all wrong, then how could we trust them to judge anything at all? And yet, for all this sense of unraveled absurdity, the questions posed by the shallow pond remained uncomfortably unresolved. Why should it make a difference whether a dying child was right in front of you or not? And if it were your duty to rescue one child, then why not 5 children? Or 1,000? How did this happen? How did one drowning child become thousands of children drowning in an infinite succession of shallow ponds, in the prospect of a lifetime spent frantically racing from one rescue to the next? How did the price of morality rise with such startling speed and so staggeringly high? How did this simple argument manage to make a conclusion so foreign to common sense appear to arise from the most conventional and robust of moral instincts? It did so by blurring the difference between what to most people appear to be completely different moral situations: charity and rescue. Rescue, helping a person right in front of you, such as a child drowning in a shallow pond, seems to most people to be a duty, as long as it isn't dangerous. Charity, in the sense of helping an unseen person far away, does not. Some people, of course, consider charity a duty, but a limited one, not the near infinite duty that Singer was talking about. To most people, the distance between themselves and another person, physical as well as emotional, is a deep moral fact. It makes a profound difference to their sense of duty. A person who is far away, whom you cannot see or hear, and with whom you have no memories or loyalties in common, cannot compel your help in the same way as a person who is right in front of you, or is in some sense one of your own. Ignoring the cries of a drowning child is a violation of the most basic kind of compassion. Anyone who did that would seem less than human. Cultivating sympathy for unseen and unknown people, on the other hand, seems an abstract, second-order, extra credit sort of moral emotion. Admirable enough, but more than can be required of an ordinary person. Singer knew that to most people these differences were significant, but he set out to show that they shouldn't be. Physical distance, in particular, appeared to him to carry no moral weight whatsoever. How could a person who would consider it unforgivable to allow a child to drown in front of him be content to let an equally helpless child die, just because he was farther away? It made no sense. Peter Singer is a utilitarian, which is to say that he believes that a person should figure out the moral thing to do, not by consulting a list of rules. Don't steal, don't murder, honor your father and mother, help old ladies across roads, but by trying to bring about the most well-being possible in the world. In principle, this means that a person ought to be concerned with well-being as such, and neutral about whose well-being it is. Which means that we ought to be as much concerned about faraway strangers as about people right in front of us, or even our own families. In fact, many utilitarians believe that it's usually best if people care more for their families than for strangers, because the world works better that way. But this is merely a pragmatic concession. Singer even includes animals, as well as humans, in his calculus of obligation. Because when it comes to well-being, he believes, as Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, famously put it, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? To accept this idea, that, in principle at least, we owe as much to distant strangers as to people we are close to, is to reject a core part of what most people believe. Even to dismiss the importance of physical distance is extremely radical. As the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has pointed out, a strict utilitarian would not rescue the child from the shallow pond at all. He would leave the child to drown, sell his unmuddied clothes, and donate the proceeds to a charity that could save more than one child with the money. That is how bizarre it is to dismiss physical distance. But of course, displacing the preeminence of duty to family is a far greater leap. You might say that this question of family versus strangers is one of quality rather than quantity. Whom I must help, rather than how much. In practice, though, there are almost always many more strangers in direr need than relatives. But it's not only in its embrace of impartiality between family and strangers that utilitarianism is radical. It's even more radical in how much it demands. In some rules-based moral systems, after all, there is the possibility that as long as you follow the rules, once you have done your duty, you are free to use the rest of your time and resources as you like. You haven't stolen anything or murdered anyone. You have honored your parents. You have helped old ladies across the road. And now you can go about your business, assured that you are a decent human being. But utilitarianism claims that you should act so as to bring about the most well-being possible in the world. Taken literally, this means that every single thing you do, at every moment of your life, should be motivated by that goal. Which is to say that there is no point at which you can say, I have done my duty, I have followed the rules, and I am now free to do what I want. Singer is pretty extreme as utilitarians go, but he isn't the most extreme. Probably the most astonishingly demanding utilitarian was one of the first of the breed, William Godwin, a contemporary of Bentham's, husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, father of Mary Shelley. Writing soon after the French Revolution, Godwin declared that the desire to take special care of one's family and friends was a pernicious impulse that should be classed with the passions, alongside avarice or the love of fame. To him, there was no life outside duty, because duty was infinite. A man, quote, has no right to dispose of a shilling at the suggestion of his caprice. So far from being entitled to applause for having employed some scanty pittance in the servants of philanthropy, he is in the eye of justice a delinquent if he withheld any portion from that service. This position was pure, consistent, and invigoratingly radical. But it proved so universally repellent that utilitarianism hastily retreated to the safety of moderation. In utilitarianism's sensible middle years, the years of John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick, the second half of the 19th century, it emerged as a gently pragmatic doctrine, definitely progressive, but with all traces of Jacobin outrageousness removed. For Mill and Sidgwick, instincts such as love for one's children and loyalty to one's friends were so obviously useful that they should be encouraged, even if, in some cases, they worked against the general good. In fact, most of conventional morality should be left intact. After all, Mill wrote comfortingly, quote, "The occasions on which any person, except 1 in 1,000, has it in his power to be a public benefactor are but exceptional, and on these occasions alone is he called on to consider public utility. In every other case, private utility, the interest and happiness of some few persons, is all he has to attend to." This was very reasonable, and in accord with the moral intuitions of most people. The only problem was that it wasn't true. And so, 100 years later, Peter Singer appeared like the ghost of William Godwin to call utilitarianism back to its exigent roots. To a non-utilitarian, such an extreme morality as Singer's or Godwin's can seem not just oppressively demanding, but actually evil, because it violates your duty to yourself. To require a person to think of himself as a tool for the general good could be seen as the equivalent of kidnapping a person off the street and harvesting his organs to save 3 or 4 lives. To demand that of somebody else would be wicked, and even to ask it of yourself seems wrong, even perverted. Impartial, universal love seems the antithesis of what we value about deep human attachment. The British philosopher Bernard Williams despised utilitarianism, but he thought duties to oneself were fraudulent. Just a clever way of, as he put it, laundering the currency of desire. He thought it was cleaner to put it straightforwardly. Morality does not always trump other concerns. Morality likes to make it seem as though outside its kingdom of duty, there is only meaningless, selfish impulse, but this is not true. Much of life exists there also. If a person is at every moment required to be attending to his moral duty, then much of what makes life worth living and people worth loving will have to be abandoned. Suppose a man could save either his wife or 2 strangers from drowning, Williams proposed. A utilitarian might ask, is it permissible for the man to save his wife? But even to ask that question in such a situation was to have, as Williams dryly put it, one thought too many. A loving husband would save his wife spontaneously, without consulting moral rules at all. To grant morality the power to adjudicate impartially in situations like that would be to abandon what gives human life its meaning. Without selfish partiality to people you are deeply attached to, your family and friends, to place, we are nothing. We are creatures of kinship and loyalty, not blind servants of the world. Not surprisingly, utilitarians are rare, even among do-gooders. Very few people believe they owe as much to strangers as to family. And most do-gooders, like most people, think about morality in terms of rules and principles, what they ought and ought not to do, rather than quantities of well-being. On the other hand, even a non-utilitarian will start to think about quantity if the numbers are big enough. It might seem repellent for a person to question whether he's permitted to save his wife from drowning rather than 2 strangers, but what if it were 5 strangers, or 50, or 5,000? And what if his wife were a demented serial killer on the lam? At a certain point, even the most emotional anti-utilitarian, with no do-gooder tendencies at all, would start to feel guilty. What do-gooders and utilitarians have in common is the belief that most ordinary ideas about how much you owe to strangers and how much duty can demand of you are wrong. A do-gooder might believe, like any ordinary person, that you should save your wife rather than 2 strangers from drowning, but as the number of drowning strangers increases, the do-gooder will worry far sooner than the ordinary person whether it's immoral not to change his mind. And the number of hours in the do-gooder's life when he feels free to do entirely as he likes, when he owes nothing to the world, when he has done his duty, and what remains of his day and his money and his energy are his alone, are very few. So, is there a limit to what morality can demand of us? To believe that everyone is duty-bound to bring about as much good as possible is to suggest that there is no difference between basic duties, like telling the truth, and the most saintly acts of self-abnegation. Not only is this idea at odds with the way most people think about morality, it threatens to destroy the idea of duty altogether. If sacrificing your life for a stranger is as much a duty as not lying or not stealing, if buying a pair of shoes is as bad as failing to rescue a child drowning in a pond, then it can seem that not lying or not stealing is no more required than sacrificing your life for a stranger. Duty must be a law that everyone is bound to obey, no matter what, or it isn't duty. To demand too much can be as corrupting as demanding too little, and to demand too much crushes aspiration. If every good act is required, then none is praiseworthy. There is no more virtue, only duty and vice. Singer's conclusions strike many people as so extreme as to be almost crazy. Nowadays, a moral theory according to which nearly everyone appears immoral to the point of depravity seems ridiculous. In the past, however, it's worth remembering, the idea that nearly everybody was a wretched sinner seemed perfectly normal. The do-gooder belief that one is obliged to take care of strangers as well as one's family can seem like a violation of human instinct. But human instincts do not all tend toward comfort and love. Sacrifice is a human instinct too. There is an instinct to hoard for one's family against future disaster. But there is too an instinct to send gifts out into the unknown. There is a sublime austerity about giving to unseen, unknown strangers, like the belief in an unseen and mysterious deity. If it's unnatural to adopt, as Henry Sidgwick put it, the point of view of the universe, as do-gooders try to do, then it is equally unnatural to imagine the point of view of God.